Thank you for joining us on the next Sustained Interfaith Dialogue. I'm going to start with announcements so we all know what's going on. We are filming today, so I'm going to remind my panelists to do your best to use the microphone. Lots of us have a tendency to turn our heads and you can't be heard. Those of you who have questions, and I know there are some of you, and if there aren't, I'm going to cajole you until you have questions. Just make sure you speak up nice and loud so everybody can hear you. The first announcement is our Diwali celebration this Friday at 6 p.m. right in the room that we're in right now. Natalia has told me we have 10 more spots, so there is room to come enjoy some really phenomenal food, learn a little bit about Diwali, and enjoy some music. We've got a sitar artist playing for us this year. So students, just sign up on Redbook. Community members, if you just reach out to Natalia while you're here today, she can reserve a spot for you.
She'll be back.
Students, I'm going to remind you again about the yellow form. This is how we know how well we're doing, how well we're not doing, and your chance to give us ideas on how to do better. So if you can make sure to fill those out as you're listening, or jot down answers real quick at the end, give those to Natalia on your way out the door. So I'm making sure I've done all my Natalia reminders. All right, so our topic today is evil and human suffering. We've all had the experience of suffering, and many have questioned the purpose of suffering. Some have noted that the conception of God held by many seemed to be at odds with the very existence of evil. In ancient Greece, a philosopher named Epicurus articulated the classical problem of evil in this way. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. If he's both able and willing, then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And this is the philosophical issue that arises from simultaneously holding on to the idea of a good God and recognizing the reality of seemingly meaningless suffering. Today we want to engage the philosophical issues, but we also want to try to understand the appropriate responses to suffering. So as usual, I'm going to ask two questions of our panelists. I'm going to give them 3 minutes to respond, and then there's going to be a slightly annoying little trill that I will shut off as quick as possible. When you hear that, just finish up the thought you're on, and then we'll move on to the next person. And our idea is to get just a tidbit, a taste of our response, our ideas on this, informed by our tradition. I'm going to remind my panelists, though they know this, their job is not to represent the entire religious tradition, but to speak from their own experience informed by their tradition. When the panelists have each had their say, I'm going to turn to the audience, and you're going to become our next panelist, and you're going to have a chance to ask questions of the panelists, to offer your own reflections, and our hope is through that process we'll get into a dialogue, we'll get into a conversation back and forth. I have students from my class on evil, so I know they'll be asking good questions. I have students from my other class who I'm sure have noticed bad stuff in the world. This is your chance to ask questions about that as well. As usual, I want to ask 2 questions, give them those 3 minutes, and then we'll move from there. Our 2 questions for today. What do you understand the source of suffering, both human and otherwise, in the world to be? And what do you hear in your tradition about the appropriate response to suffering, both human and otherwise? And we'll start with Sensei Tony.
Thank you. So, this is a subject we get into pretty deeply. As Buddhists, and again, I'm not speaking for every Buddhist, but I don't think anything I'm going to say would have any opposition from anyone that I can think of. But for us, the idea of evil or suffering, I use a threefold process. The first thing I do is look at reason. So I look at what's the science say, what's the knowledge that we have about why people do certain things. Secondly, we look at the philosophy and sort of the history we've had with these issues and how they've been addressed. And third is my own experience, how I've experienced that in my own life. And so out of that, we try to form an opinion. So for us, if someone commits like an act of violence, we would look at the circumstances to see why that happened. We would believe that essentially it was either some extreme form, maybe a form of mental illness, maybe it was some kind of duress or stress they were under. Ultimately for us, everything is about the mind. So if someone does something intentionally to harm someone, we would say they're deluded. And so we would go from that perspective. And we would try to understand it from that perspective and try to work with it as well. And as far as suffering itself goes, we kind of look at suffering as the source of compassion. That one of the things we recognize is that because there's suffering in the world, the reaction or the response has been compassion. And compassion is something that didn't necessarily have to exist, but it does exist. And so we nurture the practice of compassion as the answer to suffering. And we don't really get into big ontological arguments about people and whether people are evil or good. For us, it's just a matter of conditioning.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Pastor Justin.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to kind of jump to the second question here from a practical, theological level. As a pastor, especially as a younger pastor, you get into situations where you're talking to a bunch of people about their suffering, and you notice that there is not any kind of easy prescriptive answer to say why things are going on at times. And my tradition, as defined by the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, says that there's multiple reasons why humans suffer, why the world is suffering. There's different agents of suffering, including ourselves in this room, to bring suffering into the world. We would also say the unseen realm is something, such as the quote-unquote devil. Philosophies of mind can cause suffering. And the traditions that I was thinking about this morning, what are the appropriate responses? There are a lot of different responses in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures that help to inform my life and Christian lives. When I think of the tradition of Job in response to suffering, there's this idea of coming to grips with the fact that I don't know everything and that I am not God. This idea that all of my religiosity, all of my philosophies, all of my high-mindedness at some point run out, and I need to humbly respond and see myself in a way that is both grand and also very tiny as compared to the world around me. In the psalmist tradition, there's this idea of God is actually kind of telling us and giving us permission to complain. He's saying, if you believe that the scriptures are the word of God, he's in the Psalms, there's this idea of like, God, where are you? This suffering and this evil is happening. Where are you? Are you asleep, God? You need to wake up and come to our defense because we can't get out of this. The suffering is overtaking me. The sorrow of my heart is overtaking me. And so there's an appropriate response in also complaining about suffering. It's almost like God inviting us to say, no, you need to complain about this. You need to bring this up because this isn't the way that the world should be. There's also a sense of awe as a response when you think about the life of Christ and the idea that the transcendent God transcended his transcendence and became man, and that he entered into our human suffering. And this idea that, that Jesus wept, that the God that transcends over everything has also been able to enter into our suffering and feel what we feel as a human being, and experience death as we will experience as a human being. And that idea of compassion, with what Tony said, this idea of suffering with, that's what the word compassion means, to suffer with. We have a God that also suffers with us, so there's a response of worship. And then some of the New Testament writings have things about that we rejoice with those who rejoice, and we weep with those that weep, we mourn with them. And also sometimes there's this weird notion of we're supposed to, as the Apostle Paul says, we're supposed to rejoice in our sufferings at times. Because through certain kinds of sufferings, again, not all suffering is the same, is that actually helps to weed out sin and to develop character within us.
Great, thanks very much. Mr. Deshpande.
Good morning, namaste, and wishing everybody a very, very happy Diwali. There will be Diwali celebration here in LBC this Friday at 6 p.m. Suffering, evil, as well as good things in life are considered as real and part of life in Hinduism. The source of all of it is considered mainly as karma. Karma means deeds that we do. Hinduism also believes in rebirth, so it may not be just the deeds of the present life, but it could be because of the deeds of the past life. The evil and suffering are extremely, they are extensively discussed in Hindu texts. It is not linked to God. Hinduism doesn't say that the suffering or evil is caused by God, but considered as innate nature of living and cycle of rebirth. In Samkhya school of Hinduism, there are three kinds of sufferings described. The sufferings can occur because of your own deeds as well as without you doing anything. So there can be some body and mind suffering because of your own nature of not working out, eating bad food, greed, and being angry and things like that. Then other suffering could be because of some other men, beasts, reptiles. And the third kind of suffering could be because of the nature, like there could be flood, drought, and we suffer because of that. The solution to evil and suffering in Hinduism is considered as moksha. You do good things and you will be done with the cycle of rebirth. You will attain moksha. That is the goal of Hinduism. Different gods, such as Ganesha, Krishna, Devi, they are worshipped to have spiritual support and liberation when one faces evil and suffering. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Rabbi Sam.
Thanks, Jay. Shalom, everyone. What's going on? It's good to be here. For the source of suffering, I was thinking about just telling you an insufferable story and seeing what your reactions would be. Because if you're so bored that you're questioning your existence, that might be well in line with what the faith-based traditions say about your physical reality. A lot of traditions, including Judaism and some that you've heard already, talk about the state of unity, a state of being one with God where you're at peace with the world. You're b'shalom, you're in peace. We then experience the physical world where you have pains. Your body might upset you in your joints. You might have a headache. It might be hard for you to concentrate. In a lot of ways, that's the source of the suffering, is your physical body. There's a lot of interesting stories and teachings about that separation. The idea that in the Garden of Eden, people were perfect, that there was no death, and then only when they ate from the fruit of knowledge, the fruit of knowledge of death, that they were able to experience that pain and that separation. One of the understandings of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, is that you can get your way back to the Garden of Eden through doing certain things. In the Jewish faith-based tradition, it's mitzvot. Other religions have other ways to get back to that holy sense of unity, which would be separate from physical pain and suffering. I'd like to point out that a lot of this suffering is psychosomatic, where we make it for ourselves. It might be something that we ruminate on, and so it causes us a lot of distress. It reminds me of one of the stories of the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, who in his book Man's Search for Meaning said, to live is to suffer, but to survive and thrive is to give purpose to your suffering. He then describes one of his most insufferable moments at the camps, where had nothing to do with death. He was working in a specific arrangement, and he decided to take one 20-second break to catch his breath from breaking up cold, frozen gravel on one of the German roads. And that's when one of the SS soldiers saw him slacking off and called him a lazy pig. And he said out of all the experiences of suffering, that was the one that got to him the most because it was so incongruous with what he was actually doing. So psychologically can be the cause of a lot of our suffering too. And what Judaism does is it takes that type of negative inclination of suffering, and when you associate that with a way to make yourself a better person, it's called your Yetzer Tov, your good inclination. When you give in to your suffering, and when you choose to see things only as negative rather than as a way to connect to the divine, it's called your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination. So through this idea that there is a uniform place where people are at one and in peace, and Kabbalah can take us back there, and through the physical dimension where we actually experience suffering, it's up to us to build kind of the rungs to the ladder back to that place of unity and peace.
Great, thanks very much. Ms. Milan.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Do I have to speak up more?
A little louder.
Okay, is that right? Okay, so I don't speak for all atheists. There are some atheists who come to stop believing in God because of the amount of suffering and evil that they see in the world. And really, I think from atheists that I've talked to and know, this is because that they once believed in the three omni God, the all-loving, the all-powerful, the all-knowing. And I think that evil in the world is evidence against, I won't say proof, but evidence against that God. And indeed, evil in the world is probably the reason why I stopped believing in that God. But there are other gods. There are gods that don't care enough to take away evil and suffering. There are gods that don't know enough. There are gods that aren't powerful enough. And the presence of suffering and evil in the world are no problem for these concepts of God. For my own sake, I have come to disbelieve in God because I haven't come across a concept of God that's coherent, that I can believe in, that is supported by evidence. If somebody can give me a concept of God that I haven't heard before and that hangs together as a definition, I'd be willing to reconsider. However, the presence of evil in the world and such extravagant evil, such gratuitous evil, I think is evidence against God. You could say, well, how would you know what good is unless there was suffering and evil? Well, do we need quite so much suffering and evil? Do we need for animals to suffer? Do we need for newborns to suffer before they die? This seems to me a gratuitous amount of evil. However, if you don't believe that there is a God that guides things, that interferes, then evil actually becomes no problem. There's nothing for you to explain away. If the universe is not made for you, if there is nobody watching over you, then you would expect to have good fortune and bad fortune. A response to evil, there I draw on my humanism. The response to evil is to help. The response to evil and suffering is to go out and try to eliminate suffering, reduce suffering. So this is a call to action for humanists. And I'll point out that today we have far less suffering than we used to have. And that's down to, and that is down to a more, I think, sophisticated ethic, better tools for helping alleviate suffering. There was a time when 90% of everybody in the world was desperately poor. Now 10% of the people in the world are desperately poor. That still breaks my heart. I would like it to be 0. But I think 90% to 10% is something that we might be forgiven for thinking of as progress. So it is possible to, by doing things yourself as humans, it's possible to reduce suffering.
Great, thanks very much. Mr. Omar.
Assalamu alaikum, and peace among you all. According to Islam, I would like to give you the truth about the Islam and what the Quran about. Regarding to good and evil, it's already mentioned in the Quran many times. God created evil for a reason. He created Satan for a reason. That's one of his creation. And also he created mankind, to serve him and obey and follow his guidance. So as hardship or sadness or suffering in life, God in the Quran, he ordered us or told us that we're going to go through suffering. We're going to go through hardship in life. This is part of our lifetime. And this is for a reason. The reason is to see if we're going to really follow, we understand, the meaning of life, the meaning of just the greatness of God and why he's there. And we have to go back to him because we need him. It's kind of a reminder for us. So it's a test. So God in the Quran always give us this test during our lifetime. Could be a hardship, could be death, could be somebody disabled, any kind of suffering. So the reason for that, for us to take it, understand it, and also act upon it by being patient and thankful. So this is how it's supposed to be as a believer in Islam. So we have to accept it and go with it and work with it. So it's something maybe you don't like, but you have to accept it. And God told us in the Quran. So I'll give you an example. So some verses in the Quran. God said in the Quran, whoever does good does it for himself, and whoever does wrong bears the guilt on himself. Your Lord does no wrong to his creatures. So this is one verse. The other verse said, every soul will know the taste of death. We as God, he said, we tempt you with evil and good as a trial, and to us you will return. So as a believer, if something happened to me, if something happened to a family member or somebody I know, death or hardship, what I need to do is go back to God, pray, ask forgiveness, ask for help, because that way we'll show ourselves as we need him, because we are weak and he's a strong, he's a powerful one. So we always go back to him and kind of remind him, because if you forget about God and we forget about why we're here, God will give us this test in life to go back to him and ask forgiveness, ask for help, because we need him. In the end, we need him, he doesn't need us. And if we go through this test in life, we can earn heaven in the end. But if we disagree or say no, I don't like that, I don't like what God did to me or did to my family or anybody I know, I hate God, so that will turn out, if I die that way, I can go to hell for that. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. All right, so now I'm going to turn to you all. I'm going to read my 2 questions again. If we're lucky enough to have more than one person that wants to talk at the same time, raise your hand and I'll keep track of folks. So again, our 2 questions. What do you understand the source of suffering, both human and otherwise, in the world to be? What do you hear in your tradition about the appropriate response to suffering, human and otherwise? Or you can disregard those 2 questions and ask someone on the panel a question. It's your turn. Thoughts, questions?
This is like the definition of suffering.
You have to wait more than 3 seconds. At least 12 seconds before the suffering. In the back, please.
Okay. Sorry, it's going to start off sort of disruptively, but I guess I was not expecting the focus to be on suffering today. When I came and I was thinking about the evil as I'm experiencing it in my life, I wasn't thinking about suffering. I was thinking about malicious, awful things that are being done right now in the world and how I respond to them. So it doesn't seem fair to ask you to think about something different than what you were asked to think about.
It's totally fair, by the way. You all get to decide what the conversation is about. So,
I
push
guess I would like to hear I would like help. I would like help. I mean, I just feel like there's evil in the air I breathe right now, and evil coming out of the ground, and I can't help but absorb it. And I don't want my body to be full of this evil that I feel around me. And I guess I need help to cope with that kind of evil that I'm talking about right now. And of course, it results in suffering, I understand. But it's not the same thing as suffering, I don't believe.
can you say a little more about what you think evil is to give them something to respond to?
Oh boy. Malicious indifference to the needs of others. Greed and the actions that people take in order to feed their greed.
Great, thanks.
Can I stop there?
If you'd like to respond. Janet.
Without having recourse, because I'm an atheist, without having recourse to demons or Satan or a fallen spirit or a broken world, my explanations are all psychological and political, and my solutions are entirely action-based. So then I would be sure to participate in politics. I would support and elect leaders that will try to take action in the world. America used to be in the position of putting pressure on countries that are treating their own citizens poorly. I think that throw that position away. It is our opportunity collectively to try to work towards improving conditions for other people in far parts of the world. I very much admire, gosh, if I ever won the lottery, I think I would turn around and give all my money to Bill Gates, who has a malaria project that I think is very important. So all my explanations for why it happens are political and psychological and cultural. All my solutions are the same, but I think that we shouldn't be blaming anybody but ourselves collectively as human beings, and we shouldn't be relying on anybody but ourselves collectively as human beings to try to improve things. As hope, I would say that things have been improved in the recent past. I think there's been a little bit of a regress right now, and we need to turn the ship around and reset our course towards improving things again for people, not only ourselves, but people around the world.
Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk for a second about the nature of evil, which is, I think, getting close to the nucleus of your question, which is these deep philosophical inquiries start with an assumption. And the first assumption is either that the universe is in fact unity or is in fact chaotic. And if it's unity, then evil is in fact an agent of God. And in which case you can find a purpose to it and you can move through it and you could grow associated with a faith-based tradition. If you view the origin of the universe as a chaotic, which you can find these myths in scientific language where it's a big bang, or whether it's a chaotic start to the universe, or everything. Every religion and spiritual system has either a universal story where all was at one or nothing was at one, and you kind of choose which is which. If you choose the starting assumption of everything's unified, then evil is actually suffering, because if everything's unified, there's a purpose to that suffering. There's a purpose to that evil, which is emotionally you're suffering, and you can kind of work through it. If it's chaotic, you would say there's no purpose to this evil, it's just arbitrary, in which case it is downright mean, and I want to box it out and push it as far away from my physical self as I can. Both of those are legitimate ways of dealing with something that's foreign and difficult for you. And religion has many different experiences of both of them. In fact, I mentioned before about mysticism in the Jewish religion. The biggest innovation that mysticism had on traditional Judaism was that they said that angels and demons are actually not associated with God. They are rogue agents in the world, and through the angels and demons trying to sway you one way or another, you can ascend up that ladder of unification to actually, the traditional idea is that God has been divorced from this world, God has been pushed out from this world, and by you not giving in to Satan, or the adversary of God, you can reunify God's spirit and then cause this type of cosmic healing. But that starts with the assumption that the evil in the world is in fact separate. And if it's separate, then God isn't all-powerful, omnipotent, and unified. God is in fact a separate agent, and evil is in fact its own rogue cause. So those are two assumptions that every person starts with, no matter what series of beliefs they have, whether it's from science to religion, and people go through back and forth as quickly as they change clothes. I lost my credit card this morning. I can tell you quite literally, the universe was chaotic. Nothing made sense. I was really angry. And then I found it in an old jacket pocket, and of course, that's exactly where I put it. Everything was unified. I didn't have to worry. And that's part of the human experience.
I would say that from the Buddhist perspective, we try to make a difference between, we were talking about evil, where we try to distinguish between pain and suffering. So for us, pain is something that's just part of life, and it's not always negative. It can serve a purpose. There are some people that are actually born without the capacity to feel pain in certain ways, and those people usually die very young. So it's kind of a defense mechanism that's built into the system. And suffering for us is not so much about the situation that's happening, but it's the way that I'm looking at the situation. So it's with my thoughts that I create my world. That's a basic mindfulness teaching. And as far as evil goes, it depends on your perspective. And that's the problem with it. When we say that person's evil or that person's actions are evil, we might be able to agree with that, but it depends on what side we're on, you know? And so I think Buddhists would suggest that we should be careful in making those judgments and look more to ourselves first to see, you know, take the speck out of our own eye before we go looking for it.
Please.
Who among you, in your traditions, speaking from your traditions, would say that the tradition comes closest to justifying war as a means to an end of suffering?
War is a means to an end.
It means to end suffering.
Means to an end of a certain group's
Such
suffering.
as World War II.
No, our current situation with the Kurds.
Well, are we speaking generally?
Sure.
So could there be a just war? A war that, although it involves suffering, is actually to prepare for a world of reduced suffering.
A better end.
A better end. I would say that war is a tool. The threat of war is a tool. It is a tool of last resort because it causes so much suffering, and because there's no guarantee that it will reduce suffering overall. And when I mean a tool of last resort, I mean last ditch. You know, nothing. The world is certainly going to be full of unnecessary suffering unless a war is prosecuted. So I'm not exactly a pacifist, but I am a reluctantist. I think war should be absolutely the last answer.
Mr. Omar.
All right, because to answer this question about the war, I think from my tradition or my belief, and also, oh, I'm sorry, can you hear me? All right, from my tradition and my belief, I think also probably other religion as well may agree with me on that, that there's a prophecy about a war that's going to happen between people. That's going to be the end of the world. So this is basically, this doesn't mean it's going to end the suffer, but this is just to happen because as God said, that's going to happen. So this, we know that as the future. We don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but you know, as the Prophet Muhammad said, this is going to happen. And after the end of this war, so people are going to live probably in peace for some time. And also from my tradition, we believe that Jesus is going to come down again. God's going to send him down to basically kill the Antichrist. So this is something of, you know, killing the evil in earth. So this is from my perspective and, you know, from my tradition.
Thank you.
I had just one other thing to say about the use of war. There has been progress there too. I mean, it may not seem like it, but we have had an extraordinary period of peace in Europe, of peace in the Americas. You know, you have to watch the news and hear about a terrible war halfway or all the way around the world. There's not nearly as many wars. They're not nearly as destructive to civilian populations, although of course they still are, as there used to be. So progress can be made in reducing the number of wars and the effects of wars as well. So that's another thing that we human beings can do.
So the Hebrew word for war is milchama, and the word lechem means bread, and that's the root of the word milchama, which is war. So the idea, at least in the Jewish Bible, is that Jerusalem was centered between these two major regional powers. You have Mesopotamia in the Far East, and you had, you know, the kingdom of Egypt, you know, in the Near East. And Jerusalem was signified right between them and was always crushed by wars. So the Jewish Bible really holds a negative view of war. It's really only when God actually sanctions the war that it's okay. In recent history, World War II was something that a lot of Jews supported, but a lot of Jews also didn't support. You know, there were a lot of Jews that felt that American Judaism was its own thing and that it should have been separate from European Judaism. And that the migration of a lot of Jews from the Middle East, even though that was a war to condemn the Jewish people, it was a very difficult thing to go through. And the leader of the Indian Jewish community, they just found a letter written by Mahatma Gandhi to the leader of the Indian Jewish community, which said, even though the Jewish people were, vindicated in their right to make war, he still didn't endorse the war. He said that the Jewish communities of Europe should just give themselves over to the chambers. So this idea of war is a very difficult one, but I think at its root, it's fought over resources. And so unless you have a egalitarian, equal way to distribute the resources for all the people in the environment and society, war is not really justified.
Jay.
Hinduism does not propagate war. Okay, the topic was evil and suffering, and we are talking about war. Okay. So, Hinduism traditionally, historically, has never invaded other country to spread the message of Hinduism or to get on their territory. But it has propagated war in the past for a holy cause. For example, famous epic of Ramayana had the monkey soldiers fighting with Ravana because Ravana kidnapped Lord Rama's wife, and he was mean and he was doing wrong things. Other epic is Mahabharata, where two sets of cousins, they fought with each other because one set of cousin, they took the money and the state from the other cousins, and that was wrong. It was done in a cheating way, fraudulent way. So there was a war, and Pandavas won against Kaurava.
Thanks.
This past Sunday, I talked about politics and Christianity at church as I was preaching, which was always a fun topic to talk about at church. And one of the things I did historically was looked at all the different ways that the Christians, from a separatist mindset of the Anabaptists, different kinds of denominations, Lutheranism, everything, up to like a synthesis mindset where like church and government are supposed to be together, have differed over the years. And so there's this broad spectrum within the Christian tradition of what is the best way to engage. So personally, I really like what Janet said, where I'm not a pacifist, but I'm very resistant to the use of war, and especially in my evangelical tradition, the overuse of justification of a holy war that is absolute junk, that I'm sorry for, America. There's also this thing, though, where it's like, where is it, Tony and I were talking, where I need to exert some kind of force in order to help somebody else not be hurt. And that's a really tough place because in John 18, when Jesus is before Pilate, there's this whole thing where, are you a king? And Jesus says, if my kingdom was of this world, my people would be fighting for me, but my kingdom is not of this world, and so we do things differently. And so as an individual follower of Christ, I hear this call to put down the sword and take up the cross. And I really liked also what Tony was saying about this idea in war also, there's these sides, and am I really in humility and in truth examining myself for the injustice and for the reasons, whether they're spiritual, whether they're in my mind, whether arrogance, that I might be against somebody else. And so there's a war kind of going on inside of me about how do I even address the idea of war at a huge level like that. Ultimately, I need to take up the cross, but what does that mean for my brother and my sister that I'm also called to defend, or my neighbor that I don't agree with at all, that I'm still supposed to protect them? So that's a great question.
Any other questions?
I guess I would just say that I would clear up for everyone that Buddhists are not pacifists. People tend to forget we create the martial arts. I think of us as having a non-violent approach to things, but we find that that's easier to do from a place of strength and weakness. And so we don't have any issue with people protecting themselves, and they have the right to do that. But we find that the more a person understands the nature of war or conflict, the better they are at avoiding it. So that's the kind of perspective we have on that.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yes, so this also calls into mind the times that we use war terminology to express mundane things in our lives, because the only time, at least in rabbinic literature, where the term war is used and applied to individuals' dilemmas is when they're fighting evil and the evil inclination within us. It says that you should experience your fight with Satan or whatever Yetzer Hara, whatever evil inclination is getting at you, like it's a war. Just like in a war, you should never, rest when you know your enemy's out and about. So too, if you know that you have, for instance, a drinking problem, you should be constantly vigilant as if you were fighting a war. So there's a lot of terminology that the rabbinic sages use about war, but it's exclusively used for how to better yourself, how to take your situation and how to ascend up to that place of unity where things are in fact together. So war terminology does have a place in the Jewish religion. It's just not used, at least it shouldn't be used to endorse actual large-scale military conflict in that way.
Go ahead, Omar.
So I just wanted to mention, as Rabbi Sam mentioned about the war or resistance or fight the enemy. So the Quran said, Allah said in the Quran, your enemy is the devil. This is our enemy. So even to resist the enemy or resist our bad self, that's called in Islam called jihad. So jihad means you resist the bad thing. So in a daily basis, we have to resist. We have to fight toward our enemy, our bad self, our bad ego, to become good people and help each other. So it's not easy to do every day. So we have to get back on our nature as human beings and be good to each other, be nice to each other, forget about the bad, evil inside us and tell us harm anybody or disrespect anybody or stereotyping, all this evil. And we fight on a daily basis. And the other thing in Islam, people cause evil as well. So bad people think in an evil way to harm others. Even my belief, we see other people like minority group, they create their own thing and they said they doing jihad or try to kill other people because they disagree with them. As Islamic teaching, this is against the belief because we should not kill innocent people for no reason. So that's evil. So that's kind of people brainwashed by the bad ideas. And this is actually far away from the teachings. And this is also considered evil as well.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
Tony, I appreciate your opening comments in that they weren't what I expected. Could you comment on the Four Noble Truths and the path to the end of suffering? And then for the other panelists, is there a path to the end of suffering within your practice or traditions?
I'll do my best. So the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path is a particular presentation of the Buddhist teachings from Southern Asia. They're kind of assumed to be universal for all Buddhists, but different Buddhist schools will have different formulations of those ideas. But the first, to do it real quickly, the first noble truth is the idea that we somehow, I'm trying to say this in a way that really makes sense. It's easy to say that suffering is caused by desire. It's easy to say that it's caused by attachment or aversion and those kind of things. That sounds like a cheap kung fu movie. Just rid yourself of all desire, It's really not about that in my perspective. It's more about recognizing what are the things that either separate us in terms of our consciousness, or the things that connect us in our consciousness. So this sense of separation, and I think we all kind of have, and it's a product, in my opinion, of our evolution, creates a sense of separation from the other. And then out of that, we create all kinds of problems for ourselves and for others. Overcoming that, and the second truth is that there can be a way of doing that. In other words, we're not fatalistic or nihilistic. We think there is actually something that we can do in our own human limited way. And that we can address this through the practice of mindfulness and meditation, and that we can experience what people call nirvana. And That's a very difficult thing to define, but what I think of it is any moment where I'm caught up in my thoughts or my feelings that are driving me towards actions that might be harmful to myself or someone else, and I'm able to stop that and look and listen deeply and analyze the thoughts that I'm having to see if they measure up to reality or if they're helpful to me. In those moments, I can experience what we say is nirvana. And the Eightfold Path was really a way of breaking down essentially the practice of meditation and mindfulness, the practice of ethics, and the practice of wisdom as a way to get to that end. I don't use them that much in my own approach to things. I come out of the Zen and Shin background, and we tend to emphasize the idea that the reason that humans are in the predicament we're in is because we have this sense of separation. And that sense of separation is what drives us crazy to do strange things. And if we can't overcome that separateness through good sources like love and compassion and fellowship, community, we will try to take that connection through power. And so that's how we kind of view that whole thing. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Go to Mark.
So for my practice, the end of suffering, basically the absolute truth is death. So this is the end that we're going to taste. As God told us, we're all going to die. There's no way to run away from it. But on a daily basis, sometimes we go through suffering as being sick or hardship or test in life or losing loved ones. This is all could be painful. So the way to face it is to pray about it, ask for guidance, and just hope, can we go through it on a daily basis. That is going to get better. As also to be optimistic. That's the part of believing as well. So on a daily basis, we pray, we hope for the best, but in the end, we know we're going to die. So we need to do the best in life, good deeds, to face this truth, to die. And then, of course, the life is short. So there is afterlife. That's what we need to look at. Like in the Quran said, there is an afterlife, there is heaven. And, if we get to heaven, so we're going to live forever. So the lifetime for us is like a study, or like this is our task, to go through the task to get to the end. The end is heaven.
Thanks. Sam. And then Jay.
So, when you ask about a path to a peaceful time, a time where there's no evil, I get this vision of like a map, and there's like little stages on the map, and you have to go kind of like a board game where you roll the dice, maybe you get on a good space. And any map, if you've seen a number of maps, is going to distort certain parts of the map itself, whether it's a circular map, in which case Greenland looks the size of Africa, or it's going to be a square map, in which case other things are distorted. Any religion is going to have a series of experiences that will facilitate that map making, how to get to the messianic age of peace where there is no evil. And of course, there's many things in Judaism, at least, that say your work is never done. No matter how close you are to the messianic age, you're not allowed to stop the work of bringing forth peace. There's a quaint story of a rabbi holding on to a tree, and the Messiah is coming over a hill towards Jerusalem. And rather than go to greet the Messiah, you are obligated to plant your tree. You're not allowed to disengage from the work at hand. So I think the emphasis is on this life. It's not about finding some sort of collection of stories that say this is what the afterlife will look like and how to get there, we have to do this and this and this. It's about finding the teachings that make sense to you in this life, the ones that promote peace right here and right now, and to continually do them with your head, looking down. And if you look up and you happen to be in the messianic age of peace, no evil, that's great, that's what it's for. But I think it's kind of like a willful illusion so that we can get there together.
I'm going to repeat myself. There are two solutions to the suffering and evil in Hinduism. One is temporary, as I said earlier, going to different gods for spiritual support is recommended in Hinduism. That is on a temporary basis. But on a permanent basis, as I said earlier, do good things, and then you will be out of the cycle of rebirth. You will attain moksha. That's the goal of Hinduism. So that's the end of permanent solution. That's the permanent solution from the suffering and everything.
Other responses to this question?
I have a short one. I think that pain is adaptive, and we need pain because that's how we know there's something to be fixed or to be paid attention to. Even mental suffering can be taken as a symptom that maybe there's something about your life that you ought to try to fix. I don't think that elimination of evil, suffering, or whatever is pragmatically possible. We need to minimize and we need to manage. And if you take the approach of, well, we're going to reduce it as far as we can, and then after that we're going to try to manage what is left. And then reducing the amount of suffering is an ongoing project always. So, and I would also like to point out that saying that war is only justified when God says so hasn't stopped any war ever. So.
And then just quickly, so I believe that the Bible is a good news to good news story, and this has come out a lot in the past 10 years to certain theologians. But our hope as far as the end of suffering would be the renewal of heaven and earth together with God as, with Christ as the King over all. And in that there's this idea of resurrection, that even though there is going to be death, the world is also going to be renewed through the power of Christ's resurrection. And that is something that is unbelievable, and yet something that is a hope, and that is what most Orthodox Christians hold on to. And so during this time, just as Sam said and some others, like, that doesn't mean we just wait around and do nothing, is that we're here to promote justice and compassion and truth and beauty and goodness during that time. But ultimately, that's only going to come to a head at the return of Christ.
Thanks.
There's a lot of why in this, in terms of why is there evil, why is there good in this world, and I think sometimes I feel like as if good and evil just is. There is no such thing as it doesn't, good is ascended, evil is ascended, or whatever. I mean, there is a good amount of good in the world and a lot of evil in this world, and sometimes it gets down to something for me simple, is that you're listening to the good angel on one side and the evil one on the other side, and who are you listening to, at this, and what I think is that you have to increase and listen to more what is good in life in order to get in touch with the good in life. And for me, that comes from enjoying and thanking others and praying for others and enjoying the good in my life and being thankful for that. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and that's a point of where we give thanks for what we have, for life, for food, for companionship, for enjoyment, for the people that we have in our lives, how they have given us good things in our lives. And I think the more I get in touch with that, the more I am less inclined to listen to the evil in that I know that's out there. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I'm just saying that it helps to get in touch with the good by being thankful.
And if I could take off on that a little bit, we also think it's really good to get into the dark side. In fact, we would go so far as to say that if you really want to understand evil or darkness, you have to find that within yourself. Like, one of the things I say is when I see someone do something heinous or terrible, and I mean this sincerely, my meditation is, why did I do that? Because when I stop saying, why did they do it, and I say, why did I do that? That helps me to connect with that situation. And if I want to know how to overcome that darkness, I have to find that within myself. And I also say when somebody does something really cool, I say, look what I did. But it's this idea of oneness that is our basic teaching. And so for me, that's a huge one. When I contemplate someone who does something terrible, and I ask, why would I do that? That changes my relationship to that situation.
Sam.
And that's actually a beautiful meditation. Thank you for sharing that. But I want to address a little bit about your question. It seems like you've constructed a very important ritual around Thanksgiving that gives you meaning in your life. And I think that's wonderful. I think we should all construct rituals that give us, value and benefit, as well as thanking the blessings that we have. I'd also like to point out that the origin of Thanksgiving was actually not, the unfair trade between the Native Americans and the white people. It was during Civil War where there was a massive, civilian casualties. And President Lincoln said, even though, this house divided shall not stand, he said, our fields haven't burned up, we still have crops producing, we still have things to be grateful for. So even the idea of Thanksgiving as a holiday doesn't really come from this blissful moment of like, let's just, Pollyanna, be positive here. It comes from immense suffering. And that was a conscious decision that our leader, our president at the time, chose to make. And so in our own lives, we have the ability to look at things in many different ways. I'm sure celebrating that first Thanksgiving south of the Mason-Dixon line was very different than north of the Mason-Dixon line. And similarly, as we should look in ourselves for the good and the evil out there, we should look at our holidays and treat them as the complicated nature that they are.
All right, so I saw two hands, but we are out of time, so I'm trying to respect your time. I'm going to remind students to fill this out, remind everyone to join us for Diwali, and invite all of you to join us for the next dialogue, which I don't have off the top of my head. Hey, Dan, can you give me the date and the theme, the date and the theme for the next dialogue? On your right-hand side, there's a little flyer.
November 19th, charity and social responsibility.
Awesome. So we'll go from evil and suffering to what we can do to make the world a better place. Please join me in thanking the panel, and we'll see you next time.